They showed up at my garage dressed like cops, flashing fake badges, saying they were there to seize my guns. My neighbors were watching. My so-called friend was siding with them. And in that moment, with the safe behind me and years of service in my bones, I had to decide. Was I going to break, or was I going to fight back with everything I knew? The sound of boots echoed faintly on my driveway, sharp against the morning quiet. I stood in my garage, sunlight spilling across the concrete floor, warming the cold steel tools lined neatly along the wall. My workbench was spotless, everything in perfect order, the way years of military training had drilled into me. And there it was, my gun safe standing tall in the far corner. The kind of safe you don't just walk past without noticing. They noticed it. "Hand over your guns now or we'll call the real cops." That was the first thing out of their mouths. No greeting, no hesitation. Just a barked order, as if they owned the place. I turned slowly, scanning the three men in my garage. Their uniforms looked official at first glance. Badges glinting, radios crackling, clipboards tucked under their arms. But something about them felt off. To a casual eye, maybe they looked like law enforcement. To me, they looked like Halloween had shown up a few months too early. I've been through war zones. I've buried brothers on foreign soil. I've stared down real enemies who would rather see me in the ground than breathing. And now 3 neighborhood punks in knockoff uniforms thought they could intimidate me? I almost laughed, but instead of laughter, what came out of me was silence. A silence heavy enough to choke the air. I locked eyes with the tall one, the one who spoke first. I let my gaze rest on him, calm, still, unblinking. Years of service had taught me the power of a steady gaze, how it could cut deeper than any shouted word. His bravado faltered for just a second. In that moment, I wasn't just a man in a garage. I was every soldier I had ever served alongside, staring back through my eyes. And yet, beneath that stare, there was something else. Pain. Quiet, invisible, but always there. That gaze carried memories I never speak aloud, the kind of memories that make your chest tighten at night when the world is finally quiet. I didn't need to say a word. He could see it. That was enough. The tall one straightened, puffing his chest again as if to remind himself he was in charge. "Sir, I'm Troy Bennett with HOA Security Enforcement," he said, holding out his insignia like it meant something. His voice carried that fake authority you hear from mall guards who've practiced their lines in the mirror. HOA Security Enforcement. Never heard of it. The other 2 flanked him, standing with clipboards and cheap radios pretending to be professional. To anyone else, maybe the act would have worked, but I saw right through them. Their steps had no discipline. Their patches reflected the sunlight wrong. Their radios crackled, but the codes they used weren't real. I had spent years listening to comms in combat zones. One wrong word and you knew something was fake. These men weren't law enforcement. They were actors and not very good ones. Still, I didn't move. My arms stayed crossed. My feet stayed planted. My gun safe stood silent behind me, a symbol of everything my family had fought to protect. 3 generations of service. My grandfather's hunting rifle. My father's Vietnam-issued sidearm. My own service weapon. Steel and wood, but more than that. History. Legacy. Sacrifice. And here they were, circling it like sharks smelling blood. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. But inside, something was stirring. A shift. A warning. That safe was more than metal. It was memory. It was the one object in this house that connected me to every man in my family who'd carried the weight of service. It would return again before this story ended, in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The middle one, short and jittery, started reading from papers that looked official. "We're authorized under subdivision regulations," he stammered, "to investigate firearms compliance." His voice cracked halfway through. He tried to sound confident, but his hands betrayed him, sheets shaking like leaves in a storm. The third one, built broad like a linebacker, kept muttering into his radio. Static. Phrases that sounded close to real law enforcement chatter, but not quite. like a bad impression of something you've only ever seen on TV. And then, recognition, the tall one's face. I had seen it before. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. Not in a uniform. Not in any military context. No, it was recent, civilian, and then it hit me. Bennett's Bargain Beds, a cheesy mattress commercial. The jingle, the oversized pillow dance, the promise of dreams come true for the whole family. That's where I had seen this so-called officer. He wasn't law enforcement. He was a salesman. I stepped forward closer, close enough to study his face in the morning light. "Aren't you the guy from that furniture ad?" I asked, my voice steady. His face went pale. The confidence drained faster than rain through a storm gutter. His shoulders slumped. The others glanced at each other, panic flickering in their eyes. 1 second, he was Officer Authority. The next, he was just Troy Bennett, a mattress salesman caught in a costume. That was the moment I knew exactly what I was dealing with. Imposters, pretenders, men who thought paper badges and thin uniforms could give them power over me. But in their desperation, they had made one mistake. They chose the wrong man to target. My phone was already in my pocket. I tapped the camera, letting it roll quietly. 3, 2, 1. Military protocol activated. Not dramatic. Not shouted. Just automatic. Like breathing, like muscle memory. Years in Afghanistan had taught me that counterfeit authority could get you killed. You learn to read uniforms, to listen for real comms, to trust the instincts that tell you when something is wrong. These men were trying the same intimidation playbook I had seen in war zones, only now the battlefield was my garage. "Step away from my property," I commanded, planting my stance between them and the safe. My voice didn't rise, but it carried weight. Weight that comes only from lived authority, not borrowed costumes. The nervous one swallowed hard. "Sir, these are official HOA enforcement papers," he insisted, though his voice cracked like a boy in puberty. His hand shook so badly the papers rattled in the air. The credibility drained from him with every syllable. Their confidence was already breaking. But what I didn't know then was how far this theater would go, and who was pulling the strings behind the curtain. Because just when I thought I had seen the full extent of their charade, a voice rang out from the driveway. "If you won't cooperate with our security team, I'm calling the real police." Her words cut sharp, dramatic, almost rehearsed. Diane, my neighbor, arms crossed, chin lifted, righteous indignation dripping from every word. Behind her, a crowd of neighbors was starting to gather, holding signs, clutching phones, whispering among themselves, and as I looked from Diane's stern face to the fake cops sweating in my garage, a single thought pushed through the rising storm in my chest. What kind of neighborhood had I moved into? I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The masks, the lies, the staged drama, all of it was part of something much bigger. And before the day was over, I would learn just how far people will go when they believe they can strip away a man's rights. So I'll ask you, what would you have done? Played along or called their bluff? Because what happened next changed everything. The crowd thickened outside my garage, and I could feel the weight of every stare pressing down on me. Diane stood in the driveway, one hand on her hip, the other clutching her phone like it was a weapon. She raised her voice, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "This man is a danger to all of us. He's armed, unstable, and threatening the safety of this community." The words cut deep, sharper than any blade. For a moment I felt the heat of shame crawl up my neck. Not because her words were true, but because I could see doubt flicker across the faces of people I had greeted on morning walks, waved at across fences, even helped carry groceries. Her performance was strong enough to plant fear, and fear spreads like fire in dry grass. The fake officers shifted uneasily beside me, pretending to hold their ground. They adjusted their flimsy radios and glanced at Diane as if waiting for her next cue. It struck me then, This wasn't just random harassment. There was orchestration here, someone pulling the strings, turning my garage into a stage and me into the villain of a script I hadn't agreed to. I steadied myself, drawing from memories I didn't want to revisit. Afghanistan. Dust storms that blinded your eyes and clogged your lungs. Checkpoints where counterfeit uniforms showed up daily, men pretending to be allies until they weren't. I had seen the look of false authority before, and I knew how fast it could escalate. My voice carried the same steel I used back then. Step back from my property. You have no legal standing here. The linebacker-looking one muttered into his comm again, voice tight, desperate. Static replied. I knew the truth. They had no backup. Just noise. But Diane didn't know that. Neither did the neighbors. To them, this still looked like an official standoff. Do you see this? Diane shouted to the gathering crowd. He's barricading himself in with weapons. He's refusing to cooperate with community safety measures. What kind of neighbor does that? That was the moment I pulled my phone higher, making sure everyone saw the red recording light. These men are not police. They're impersonators. And Diane, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, is staging this entire performance. The murmurs began. People shifted. Some leaned closer to their screens as Diane, with theatrical flair, pulled up her own video. Look for yourselves, she cried. Yesterday he was cleaning his weapons, pointing them toward the street. He threatened us. The clip played. There I was in the garage, oiling a rifle, adjusting the barrel, but the angle had been doctored. In the recording, it looked like I was aiming into the neighborhood. My stomach tightened. They had twisted my routine maintenance into a weaponized narrative. Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, frowned at the screen. That can't be right. I was gardening all afternoon. I saw nothing like this. Her words cracked the illusion, if only slightly. Others looked uncertain now, caught between Diane's drama and their own memories. It reminded me of another memory I rarely spoke of, a checkpoint gone wrong overseas. A civilian truck had approached too fast. My men aimed their weapons as protocol demanded, but I saw a child's hand waving from the back seat. I gave the order to hold fire. We were right. It wasn't an attack. That single decision saved innocent lives, but it left me awake for weeks, wondering what would have happened if I'd hesitated or misread the signs. Now here I was, years later, once again judged by a snapshot taken out of context. My jaw tightened. I turned to the crowd. Videos can lie, angles can deceive, but the truth never changes. I let the silence hang, my eyes sweeping across the faces. Then came the first of those strange moments, the kind that hold people's attention like a spark in the dark. If someone can twist your ordinary life into evidence against you, what would they find in your story? The effect was immediate. Neighbors murmured, glancing at their own phones, their own histories. The tall one, Troy Bennett, the mattress salesman in costume, tried to seize back control. Backup is already on the way, he barked, but his voice cracked. I noticed sweat soaking through the cheap stitching of his uniform. The badge on his chest caught the sunlight, and for the first time I realized how hollow it looked. Not polished steel, not authority, just costume jewelry pretending to carry weight. I moved closer, my voice calm, deliberate. That insignia wouldn't fool a child. Real shields have weight. Yours is lighter than a cereal box prize. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One neighbor actually chuckled before stifling it. Diane's glare snapped in his direction, sharp enough to silence him. She turned back to me, eyes blazing. Grant, you're twisting this. You're dangerous, and everyone here knows it. Do you want to scare our children? Do you want blood on your hands? Her words dripped with conviction. But behind her righteous fury, I sensed something else. Fear, yes, but not of me. Fear of being exposed. Her performance was too polished, too rehearsed. This wasn't about neighborhood safety. It was about control. I looked down at my safe again. The steel door reflected a thin beam of sunlight, almost glowing. It wasn't just a safe anymore. It was the last unbroken line between my past and my present. It held not just weapons, but heirlooms, service medals, memories. They weren't after the guns. They were after what the guns represented: freedom, sacrifice, independence. "Sir, we need to secure those firearms immediately," the nervous one stammered, waving his fake documents. His hands shook so hard the papers looked like they might tear in two. "From what authority?" I asked. "Who signed them?" "Which department? What supervisor?" He opened his mouth, but no words came, just silence. The crowd shifted again, sensing the cracks in the story. That was when Diane raised her voice even louder, calling into her phone. "Yes, operator. We have an armed veteran threatening residents. Send immediate backup." She looked at me, triumph flickering across her face. She was filing a false police report right in front of everyone, and still, I stayed steady. Because inside, another memory had resurfaced. The day I left Afghanistan, a brother in arms handed me his dog tags. "Take these home," he said. "Make sure people remember us. He never made it out." Those tags now rested in my safe, next to my grandfather's rifle. They were more valuable than any contract Diane thought she could enforce. And I swore in that moment that no imposter, no staged emergency would strip me of them. I faced Diane directly. "Call whoever you want. When the real police get here, we'll see who the criminals are." Her smile faltered just slightly. But before the crowd could react further, I leaned forward, voice low but carrying across the driveway. "The louder someone shouts about your danger, the more you should ask what they're hiding." It landed. Neighbors looked back at Diane, questions in their eyes. She gripped her phone tighter. The linebacker tried to salvage control, raising his arms dramatically. "People, step back! We're establishing a perimeter for your protection." He used hand signals he must have picked up from action movies, not training. A parody of command. I took photos, evidence of the staging. "Look at those signs," I called out. Same handwriting. Same crooked letters. Tell me that's a coincidence. Even the children noticed. Young Tommy tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Mom, if this place isn't safe, why did we move here?" His innocence pierced through the noise. The tension in my chest tightened like a knot. I crouched down to his level, my voice gentle. "You are safe, Tommy. Some adults are just playing pretend right now." Diane's face turned red. Her story was unraveling, thread by thread, and it was an 8-year-old who had pulled the first string. But before relief could settle, the hum of sirens grew louder in the distance. Blue and red lights flickered against the horizon. The crowd stirred with anticipation. Diane straightened, her confidence reborn. "Now we'll see who's right," she said, her voice dripping with certainty. For a brief second, doubt crept into me too. What if the real police believed her? What if doctored videos, false documents, and a rehearsed mob drowned out the truth? The memory of my brother's dog tags pressed against my chest from the pocket where I carried them. I touched them through the fabric, grounding myself in their weight. They weren't just metal. They were a reminder, a promise that truth, though tested, could not be erased. The cruiser pulled into my driveway, tires crunching against the gravel. An officer stepped out, surveying the scene with practiced caution. His presence changed the air instantly. This was no stage prop. This was real authority. The imposters straightened, masks slipping back into place, as if they could fool a professional. Troy stepped forward, speaking quickly. "Officer, we've secured the area. Suspect has been uncooperative with our investigation." The audacity made my stomach turn. They were still doubling down on the lie. The officer's eyes scanned the crowd, then flicked to the cheap badges, the hollow uniforms, the nervous shuffling. His expression sharpened. Something wasn't adding up for him either. He turned his gaze to me, narrowing his eyes at the command shirt I wore. His hand hovered near his holster, tension hanging in the air. Then recognition softened his face. "Sergeant Major?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "That's right." And in that instant, the entire balance shifted. But if I thought this was the end of it, I was wrong. Because the moment real law stepped onto my property, the stakes weren't just about fake cops anymore. They were about to become federal. And Diane, she wasn't finished yet. Sometimes, the real storm doesn't begin until you think the battle is over, and the storm was only just arriving. The cruiser door shut with a heavy thud that silenced the crowd. Officer Morrison adjusted his belt, his eyes cutting across the scene like a blade. Diane stood straighter, clutching her phone like it was her badge of truth. Troy and his crew stiffened, trying to look official, but the sweat stains under their collars told another story. I stayed still, arms crossed, the red recording light on my phone still glowing. Morrison studied me first. His gaze lingered on my shirt, the command patch stitched into the fabric. His hand hovered near his holster for one long second, a moment where time seemed to stretch. Then came that question, "Sergeant Major?" His voice softened, carried the weight of recognition. I nodded once. "That's right." A flicker of respect crossed his face before he turned sharply back to Troy. "Identification, now." The three imposters froze. Troy fumbled with his fake insignia, holding it out like a magician, hoping the trick would still land, even after the audience had seen the wires. Morrison's expression didn't shift. He took the badge, felt the hollow weight in his hand, and set it down on my workbench like trash. "Ma'am," Morrison said, shifting his attention to Diane, "who exactly called in the threat?" Her voice was smooth, confident. "That would be me. Officer, this man has been brandishing weapons, intimidating neighbors, creating an unsafe environment. These men are here with HOA authority to investigate." She motioned to Troy as if she had just handed over her star witness. Morrison turned back to the fake officers. "HOA authority? That's a new one. Who's your supervisor? What department are you under?" Troy stuttered, the confidence draining from his voice. We're contracted private enforcement working under subdivision safety regulations." Morrison narrowed his eyes. "Private enforcement doesn't impersonate police uniforms. That's a federal crime. And right now you look a lot like criminals trying to play dress-up." The crowd shifted, whispers breaking out. Some neighbors pulled out their phones, recording now. The mask was slipping and everyone could see it. But even as Morrison began tearing apart their facade, I felt something in me stir. Doubt, fear, not of them, not anymore. Of myself. Because Diane's words still echoed in my ears. Armed, unstable, unsafe. And for a brief moment I wondered if the people around me believed her more than me. I remembered the flashback of that child's hand waving at the checkpoint in Afghanistan. If I had been wrong that day, if I had pulled the trigger out of fear, I would have carried that guilt forever. What if Diane's performance had already planted that kind of guilt in my neighbors' minds? What if my very presence here as a veteran with weapons was enough for them to see me as dangerous, no matter what the truth was? I squeezed the dog tags in my pocket until the edges dug into my palm. That small pain grounded me, but it also reminded me of the ghosts I carried, the ones I couldn't shake even on quiet nights. Morrison's voice cut through my thoughts. "Sergeant Major, can you confirm these men are not legitimate?" I nodded firmly, but inside my chest a storm brewed. Wrong insignia, wrong comm codes, wrong posture. They're imposters. And she, I pointed at Diane, brought them here. The crowd erupted in low murmurs. Diane's face hardened, but her eyes darted quickly, betraying a crack in her certainty. Morrison raised his hand for silence. "We'll verify everything. Until then, no one moves." Then came the first engagement line, slipping out of me before I could stop it. "Have you ever felt the whole world watching, waiting to see if you'll break?" The words weren't just for them, they were for me. My knees felt heavy. My breath came shorter. I thought about my father, how he used to sit on the porch after Vietnam, staring into the horizon without a word. He carried his ghosts in silence. I wondered if my neighbors now saw the same silence in me and mistook it for danger. That's when a new voice spoke up. A woman I hadn't seen before standing near the edge of the crowd. She wore civilian clothes, but her posture was unmistakable. Straight-backed, controlled, like someone who'd lived with rank. "Officer Morrison," she said calmly. "I served with the Army Reserve. I know the difference between real uniforms and costumes. These men don't pass the test." The neighbors turned toward her. Diane froze, caught off guard. I looked at the woman, searching her face. Something about her eyes, the calm certainty, mirrored the way I used to feel before the doubt set in. After the commotion quieted, she stepped closer to me, her voice lowered. "You can't let them see you rattled. They're feeding off it. Hold the line." Her words struck harder than I expected. She was right. I'd been letting Diane's narrative crawl under my skin. My silence, my hesitation, it was fuel for their story. But I wasn't done struggling inside, because holding the line meant confronting another question. How much force would I be willing to use if they pushed harder? If Troy reached for my safe, if Diane screamed another lie that whipped the crowd into chaos, what would I do? I didn't want to be that man, the one people feared, the one Diane painted me as, but if it came to defending my family's legacy, I knew hesitation could cost everything. That contradiction twisted inside me, a moral conflict I couldn't escape. The crowd gasped as Diane pulled out her phone again, this time playing the doctored video louder. On the screen, I looked like a man aiming into the street, threatening my neighbors. My stomach clenched. "That's your proof," she shouted. "He's dangerous and we need protection from him." I stepped forward, my voice sharp but steady. "That's edited. Look at the shadows, the cuts between frames. It's fake." Morrison glanced at the video, his trained eyes catching the flaws quickly. "This won't hold up," he said flatly. But the damage was done. I saw the doubt creep back into the crowd, the same way it had crept into me. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to lash out. And that's when the second engagement line rose in my chest, unbidden. What if the fight isn't just against your enemies, but against the doubts in your own heart? The words echoed in my mind even as I forced myself to stay calm. Morrison called for backup through his radio, his voice firm, professional. "Dispatch, I need a detective and federal contact. We may have impersonation and civil rights violations here." The imposters exchanged panicked glances. Their game was collapsing, and they knew it. Diane, however, wasn't ready to let go. She stepped forward, pointing at me with fire in her eyes. "Officer, this man is unstable. He's hiding behind his uniform, but we all know what veterans like him are capable of. Look at him. Look how tense he is. Do you want him living next to children?" The words cut deep, deeper than I wanted to admit. She wasn't just attacking my character. She was attacking my service, my scars, the invisible battles I fought every night. I wanted to shout back. To tell her that discipline, not danger, defined veterans like me. That every scar was proof of restraint, not violence. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, the woman who had stepped forward earlier spoke again. "Enough. My brother didn't come home from Iraq, and I won't stand here while you spit on the service of those who did." Her voice cracked with pain, raw and real. Diane faltered, her fire dimming for just a moment under the weight of someone else's truth. I looked at the woman, and something inside me shifted. She was right. We carried these scars not as weapons, but as shields. And yet here I was, letting Diane twist them into something ugly. I straightened my shoulders, forcing my breath steady. "Diane," I said, my voice clear, "I've never threatened anyone here, but I see now that this isn't about safety. This is about control. You're willing to use fear to get what you want." She glared at me, but I saw it then, the contradiction. Maybe she believed she was protecting families. Maybe in her mind, her lies were justified, doing bad for what she thought was good. And that made her even more dangerous. The sirens drew closer. Morrison's radio crackled with confirmation. Federal agents were en route. The imposters looked like they wanted to disappear. The neighbors murmured louder, the tension thickening by the second. And just as I thought the balance was tipping, Diane made her move. She turned to the crowd, her voice trembling but loud. "If the police won't protect us, then we have to protect ourselves. Who here will stand with me?" For a terrifying moment, silence hung. Then, one man, someone I didn't know well, raised his hand hesitantly. Then another. A ripple of fear-based solidarity started forming in the crowd. My heart pounded. Diane was losing the legal battle, but she was winning the emotional one. She was turning fear into action, and action into a mob. That's when the third engagement line broke from me, sharper than I intended. When fear turns neighbors into enemies, what would you risk to stop it? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, heavy. Morrison barked out, "Everyone stand down!" His authority cut through the noise, but I knew the line had already been crossed. The trust between me and some of my neighbors was fractured, maybe beyond repair. The sound of more sirens filled the air, closer this time. Lights flashed against the houses. The real storm had arrived. And as federal agents prepared to step onto the scene, one thought chilled me to the bone. If Diane was willing to stage this much, what else was she hiding? The answer would come soon, but I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. Because sometimes the truth isn't just painful, it's dangerous. And the danger was about to escalate. The sirens cut through the air like blades, slicing the fragile silence of the street. Blue and red lights danced against the houses, bouncing off car windows, spilling into every shadow. The neighbors shifted nervously, some clutching their phones tighter, others whispering in hurried tones. Diane stood taller than ever, as if those approaching sirens were her personal army answering the call. The imposters froze in place, pale and sweaty. Troy adjusted his fake badge as though one last polish could somehow give it weight, while the linebacker type clenched his jaw and pretended his radio wasn't just static. But Morrison wasn't fooled. He stood firmly between them and me, a wall of real authority, his hand resting near his holster, but not shaking like theirs. For a split second, I thought the sight of those flashing lights might be a relief. But as the federal vehicles turned into the neighborhood, something inside me twisted tighter. This wasn't relief. It was escalation. I knew enough about how these situations unfolded to realize the truth. Once federal hands got involved, there would be no going back. The agents stepped out with precision, their boots hitting the pavement in sync. No cheap uniforms here, no hollow badges. Their presence alone shifted the entire energy of the street. The crowd hushed, caught between fear and curiosity. Even Diane faltered, though only for a heartbeat, before she masked it with another wave of false confidence. "Officers," she began, her voice smooth and commanding. "Thank you for coming so quickly. As you can see, this man is unstable and dangerous. He has refused to cooperate with our security enforcement, and he's threatening the safety of this entire neighborhood." Her words hung in the air, dangerous and heavy. I could almost feel the neighbors leaning toward her, wondering if she might be right after all. I clenched the dog tags in my pocket, the edges biting against my palm until the sting traveled up my arm. I thought of the promise tied to them, the lives cut short, the sacrifices etched into every scar I carried. They deserved more than silence. I lifted my phone higher, its red recording light glaring like a beacon. "Everything you see here is being documented," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "These men are not police. They're imposters, and Diane Carter has staged this entire farce." Morrison backed me up immediately, his voice firm. Federal agents, I've already confirmed fraudulent badges and false uniforms. We're dealing with impersonation here. But Diane wasn't finished. She raised her phone again, playing that twisted video on loop for everyone to see. My image filled the screen, me in the garage, cleaning a rifle. To anyone who didn't know better, it looked like I was aiming toward the street, toward families. The manipulation was obvious to trained eyes, but to frightened neighbors, fear outweighed logic. "Look at him," Diane shouted. "This is what we've been living next to. A man ready to turn his weapons on us at any moment. Do you really want your children growing up under that shadow?" Her words landed hard. I saw mothers clutch their kids closer. I saw men exchange wary glances. Even the federal agents paused, their eyes flicking from the video to me, trying to piece the puzzle together. That was when the first engagement line struck me, bursting out like a challenge to the whole street. When someone twists your truth into their weapon, how long before the people around you believe the lie? The silence that followed was deafening. The woman who had stepped forward earlier, the Army Reserve veteran, broke it. "That video's fake. I can see the edits clear as day. Look closer. Look at the shadows. Look at the cuts. He wasn't pointing at anyone." Her voice steadied me, but Diane countered instantly. Of course she'd defend him. Birds of a feather. Veterans sticking together even when it means ignoring danger. The cruelty of it made my jaw clench. She was painting service as a stain, as if every sacrifice we carried made us untrustworthy. And the worst part? Some of the neighbors looked like they were starting to agree. The federal lead agent, a man named Walsh, stepped forward. His voice was calm, measured, but carried authority. "We'll need all documentation. Videos, statements, everything. Until then, no one makes assumptions. Facts will determine the next steps." But facts weren't what Diane was after. She wanted fear. Fear was faster than truth, and she knew it. I stood there, breathing slowly. But inside my chest, the war raged. The memories of Afghanistan blended with the present moment. The smell of dust and burning metal, the sound of radios crackling with half-truths, the endless tension of not knowing who was enemy and who was pretending to be friend. It was all here again, right in my garage, and for the first time, doubt gnawed at me. Maybe Diane was right about one thing, not about danger, but about perception. If people already believed I was a threat, would the truth even matter? The thought terrified me more than anything. Morrison leaned toward me slightly, his voice low. "Hold your ground, Sergeant. They're trying to bait you. Don't let them." But holding my ground meant facing another truth. The longer this dragged on, the more fractured the neighborhood became. Some would never look at me the same, no matter what the investigation revealed. My reputation, my place here, was already burning. The second engagement line rose up, almost like my own conscience whispering, "What do you do when protecting your truth means sacrificing the place you call home?" I swallowed hard. The words sat heavy in my chest. Walsh began questioning the imposters. "Names, contracts, supervisor details, now!" They stuttered, exchanged nervous glances, but had nothing. Their silence was damning, but Diane tried to fill it with louder noise. "They don't have to answer to you. They answer to our community. And this community has spoken. We don't feel safe." Her voice carried like fire in the wind. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the contradiction in her eyes. Maybe she believed her own words. Maybe, in her mind, she was doing this for the right reasons, protecting families, children, peace. But she was doing it with lies, with fear, with destruction, doing bad for what she thought was good. And that was the most dangerous kind of enemy. The agent started moving, pulling out equipment, preparing to document everything. The imposters were cornered. But instead of relief, I felt the pressure climb even higher, because Diane wasn't cornered. She was doubling down. She turned back to the crowd. If they won't protect us, then we have to protect ourselves. Who here will stand with me against this man? A few hands went up. Hesitant at first, then more. Not many, but enough to shift the air. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a staged drama anymore. It was becoming a movement. Fear was gaining roots, and roots are hard to tear out once they've spread. I wanted to scream, to demand they see reason, but I forced myself still. Instead, I pressed my palm against the safe behind me, feeling the cold steel. It was more than a safe now. It was a line in the sand. Everything I had sworn to protect, everything I had carried home from war, was inside. If I let them strip that away, even symbolically, then all the battles I'd fought overseas would mean nothing. That realization hit me like a punch. And with it came something darker, a decision I didn't want to admit I was weighing. How far would I go to defend that line? The third engagement line came from that raw place, spilling out like a confession. At what point does defending what you love turn you into exactly what they fear? The weight of it pressed down on me. My breath came heavy. I felt the crowd's eyes, the agent's scrutiny, Diane's triumphant glare, and then, in a single moment that shifted everything, Walsh looked directly at Diane and asked the question that broke the surface tension. Did you hire these men knowing they would impersonate law enforcement? Her face paled just for a second. It was small, almost invisible, but I saw it. The mask cracked. The crowd stirred. Even the imposters froze, their eyes darting toward her. The silence that followed was unbearable. Finally, Diane spoke, her voice trembling but defiant. I did what I had to do to protect my community. If the law won't keep us safe, then we have to make our own rules. The admission fell like a hammer. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Morrison shook his head. Walsh's jaw tightened. The imposters looked at her like she had just signed their death warrant. And me? I felt my chest tighten, my breath catch. Because in that single moment, the fight shifted completely. This wasn't about fake cops anymore. It was about Diane, about her war against me, against veterans, against everything I represented. The agents moved in, beginning to separate the imposters from the crowd. Neighbors whispered, some in outrage, others in fear. But Diane still stood tall, her voice rising above the chaos. You think this ends here? This is just the beginning. If the law won't protect us, then we'll protect ourselves. And no one, not even him, can stop it. Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and heavy, promising more to come. And as the agents secured evidence, as the crowd fractured into sides, as the imposters were led toward waiting vehicles, I realized something chilling. This wasn't over. The turning point had arrived. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back, because now it wasn't just about my guns, my safe, or even my reputation. It was about survival in a neighborhood that had declared me its enemy. The darkest moment had only just begun. The agents closed in around Troy and his crew, their fake badges glinting weakly under the flood of flashing lights. Neighbors whispered louder now, a mix of shock and nervous excitement filling the cool evening air. Morrison stepped aside to give the federal team room, his posture stiff with controlled authority. Diane stood in the center of it all, arms crossed, her chin lifted like she was the one who had summoned justice. But I knew better. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't shaken. She was preparing her next move. The lead agent, Walsh, called for the imposters to be detained for questioning. They didn't resist. How could they? Their props were falling apart, their fabricated authority stripped away under professional eyes. But Diane didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at me directly, her expression unreadable. That was the first time it struck me. She didn't see this as a loss. She saw it as a pivot. The safe behind me hummed in my thoughts, like a heartbeat wrapped in steel. My hand brushed against it, and for an instant I felt the weight of everything inside. Dog tags, medals, heirlooms. Not just objects, anchors. And I realized something dark. Diane wasn't after the guns themselves. She was after the story those guns carried. If she could paint me as a symbol of danger, if she could twist my legacy into a threat, she didn't need to win the law. She just needed to win the people. Neighbors had started pulling out lawn chairs, as if this standoff had turned into theater. Some shook their heads at the imposters being cuffed, but others still clung to Diane's narrative. The fracture ran deep. Trust wasn't just broken, it was splintered. Walsh turned to Diane. "Ma'am, we'll need to speak with you directly. Did you knowingly employ these individuals to impersonate law enforcement?" She hesitated only a moment. "I acted for the good of the neighborhood. When the system fails, we must act ourselves." The crowd gasped. That was as close to a confession as she'd ever given. But instead of outrage, I saw something else flicker across the faces around me. Doubt, yes, but also reluctant admiration. She was bold, unapologetic. And sometimes, boldness is enough to sway the unsure. I stepped forward, unable to keep my voice steady. "You're lying to protect yourself, Diane, and you're dragging this whole community into your lie." She didn't look at me. She looked past me, at the neighbors, at the phone's recording, at the stage she'd built. "No, Grant, I'm protecting them from you." Those words landed harder than I expected, because for a split second I believed her. That was the first engagement line that slipped through the air like a cut. What if the real enemy isn't the one pointing the finger, but the doubt that grows when others start believing it? The crowd stirred again, whispers rising, shifting like wind against fire. I saw it on their faces, some beginning to question whether my truth was enough to outweigh her conviction. Morrison stepped closer to me. "Stay steady. Don't give her what she wants." But then came the twist I never saw coming. From the crowd, someone familiar stepped forward. My chest tightened when I recognized him. Jacob, my friend, my neighbor, the man I had shared beers with on his back porch just 2 weeks ago, the one who told me he respected my service, who had asked to see my grandfather's rifle one day. He raised his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's right," he said. The words hit me like a bullet. Jacob continued, his face strained but his tone steady. "I've heard him at night, shouting. Sometimes it sounds like he's arguing with someone who isn't there. My kids have asked me what those noises mean. How do I explain that?" Gasps rippled across the yard. My stomach dropped. Yes, I had restless nights. Yes, there were times I woke shouting from dreams I couldn't escape. But Jacob knew that. He'd asked about it once, and I'd told him the truth. And he'd nodded, said he understood. Now here he was, standing with Diane. "Jacob," I said, my voice breaking despite myself. "You know what those nights are. You know it's not danger, it's memory. But he cut me off. Memory or not, it doesn't change what my kids hear." The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt the eyes on me, the weight of their judgment. And in that moment, Jacob wasn't my friend. He was her ally. That betrayal cut deeper than Diane's accusations ever could. The dog tags in my pocket pressed harder against my skin. My thumb traced the worn edges until it hurt. And with that pain came another wave of doubt. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe my ghosts were louder than I realized. The second engagement line bled from that raw place inside me. When even your friends start seeing you as a threat, how do you know you're not becoming one? I tried to speak, but my throat was tight. My body felt heavy, as though the weight of years of service had all collapsed onto me at once. Walsh raised his voice, trying to reclaim control. "Enough speculation. We deal with facts, not fear." But the damage was done. A friend had become a foe, and the crowd had seen it happen. Diane seized the moment. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to something softer, almost sympathetic. "You see? Even those closest to him can't ignore the truth. We don't hate you, Grant. We fear what you might do." Her tone twisted the knife. I wanted to shout, to demand they remember who I was, what I had done for this country, how I had carried those scars so they wouldn't have to. But my voice betrayed me. It shook, it cracked, it faltered. And in that weakness, I saw Diane's victory flash across her face. But then, just as quickly, a new presence broke the rhythm. A woman walked into the crowd, pushing past those holding phones high. Dr. Rebecca Stone, a military counselor, one who had worked with veterans for years. I hadn't seen her since my last evaluation months ago. Her voice carried the weight of authority and care. "Stop." Everyone turned. She stood tall, her expression firm but compassionate. "What you're doing here isn't protection, it's persecution. I've reviewed his records. I know his service. I know his struggles. And I know the difference between trauma and danger." The crowd murmured. Diane's face faltered, but she steadied herself quickly. "And what about the shouting? The weapons? The fear?" Dr. Stone didn't blink. "Fear is easy to manufacture. Truth takes effort. And the truth is, this man has shown more restraint under fire than most people show in their daily lives. He's protected civilians in war zones, made decisions that saved lives. You call that dangerous? I call it discipline." Her words steadied me, pulled me back from the edge I hadn't realized I was standing on. But Diane wasn't backing down. She stepped forward again, louder, more defiant. "That doesn't change the fact that we feel unsafe. And feelings matter. Feelings keep communities safe." Walsh shook his head. "Feelings don't override facts. And the fact is, these men impersonated law enforcement at your direction." For the first time, Diane looked cornered. But then she did something that made the entire street gasp. She turned to the agents and raised her chin. "Yes, I hired them. Yes, I asked them to act with authority. Because I refuse to sit back and watch another community fall apart from violence. If that makes me guilty, then so be it. I'll take that guilt if it means protecting children." Her voice broke, but it wasn't weakness. It was theater, and it worked. Some neighbors clapped. Others nodded. Even in confession, she was turning guilt into martyrdom. That was when the third engagement line pierced through the noise. Not from me, not from anyone else, but from the crowd itself. A voice I didn't recognize. Sharp and cutting. What if the real danger isn't who holds the weapon, but who controls the story around it? The line settled over us all, heavy with truth. And in that moment, I realized the stakes had shifted. Diane wasn't just fighting me. She was rewriting the story of veterans, of service, of sacrifice. And every nod, every whispered agreement was proof she was gaining ground. The agents moved closer, tension rising, but the street itself felt like it was about to split in two. Friends and foes blurred, truth and lies tangled. And then Walsh's radio crackled with a message that froze the air. "Be advised, evidence from Carter's residence confirms premeditation. Extensive planning files uncovered. Stand by for escalation." The crowd gasped again. Diane's face drained of color. For the first time, her mask slipped completely. The revelation hit like thunder. This wasn't a spontaneous act. This was premeditated, planned, targeted, and as the weight of that truth spread across the crowd, I realized something chilling. This wasn't the climax. This was just the start of a darker storm. Because if Diane had been planning this for months, what else had she set in motion? The answer was coming, and I wasn't sure anyone on this street was ready for it. The street had fallen into a silence that felt alive, trembling under the weight of the words coming through Walsh's radio. Evidence. Premeditation. Diane Carter hadn't just reacted out of fear. She had plotted. My stomach tightened as that realization spread across the crowd, hitting each neighbor differently. Shock, anger, betrayal. Some dropped their phones to their sides, recording forgotten. Others looked at Diane like they were seeing her for the first time. Her face had gone pale, her lips pressed together so tightly they almost disappeared. But her eyes, those sharp, unflinching eyes, still burned with the same fire. She wasn't going to crumble. She was going to fight her way out, even if the walls around her were already falling. Walsh stepped forward, his voice hard. "Miss Carter, you'll need to come with us for questioning. We have evidence tying you to the employment of these men, and preliminary findings indicate this was orchestrated. This is no longer a neighborhood dispute, it's a federal matter." The words landed like a gavel. But Diane didn't move. She glanced at the imposters being loaded into the back of the vehicles, then at the neighbors, then finally at me. The look she gave me wasn't fear. It was something colder. A promise. She raised her chin, her voice carrying with the practiced tone of someone who knew how to sway a room. "You think this ends with me? No, this isn't about one woman. This is about a community standing up against a threat in its own backyard. You can take me away, but you can't erase the truth of what we've all seen. You can't silence the fear we feel." Her words rippled through the crowd, reigniting sparks I had hoped were gone. Some nodded again, torn between her confession and her conviction. I stepped forward, my voice steady but heavy with emotion. "You don't speak for them, Diane. You don't speak for what's real. You speak for fear, and fear has destroyed enough already." For a moment, we stood across from each other, the entire street holding its breath. Two figures, one accused, one targeted. Everything we had been building toward, every lie, every scar, every word, it all boiled down to this moment. That was when the first engagement line struck through the silence like lightning. What happens when the enemy you've been fighting isn't across the ocean, but standing right in front of your home? The neighbors shifted uneasily. Walsh's agents moved closer, ready to put Diane in custody. But she wasn't done, not yet. She turned to Jacob, the neighbor who had once been my friend. "You know I'm right," she said. "You've heard him. You've seen what he's capable of. Don't let them twist this. Stand with me." Jacob's face was pale, his jaw tight. He looked at me, then at her, then at the ground. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Finally, his voice cracked. I don't know anymore." The betrayal stung again, but deeper this time. It wasn't just Diane. It was the fragility of trust itself. Even after all the truth revealed, the lies still had claws. I wanted to yell, to shake him, to remind him of every night we'd shared stories, every moment of trust. But the weight in my chest stopped me. This wasn't about Jacob anymore. It wasn't even about Diane. It was about the story she had tried to build, and whether I could dismantle it before it consumed everything. Dr. Stone stepped forward, her voice clear. "Jacob, fear doesn't make a man guilty. Trauma doesn't make him dangerous. Don't let her turn your doubt into a weapon." But Diane's voice cut back, sharp and relentless. "And what if doubt is the only thing keeping our families alive?" The crowd erupted again, voices clashing, fear and anger colliding in waves. The agents raised their hands for order, but the noise kept building. And then I did the only thing I knew how to do. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't fight the storm with more thunder. I let silence speak. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the dog tags, and held them high. The streetlights caught their worn edges, the metal reflecting years of sacrifice. My voice came low, steady, and full of the weight I carried. These belonged to men who never came home. Men who gave everything so others could live in peace. And I'll be damned if I let their memory be turned into a reason for fear. The noise faded. Slowly, neighbors turned back to me. Phones lifted again, but not in excitement, this time in quiet reverence. The silence was thicker, sharper, and in that silence, the second engagement line came, almost like a whisper threading through the night. When silence carries more weight than screams, do you finally hear the truth? Diane's eyes flickered. For the first time, I saw something break in her expression. Not guilt, not regret, but recognition. She knew she was losing control. Walsh gave the signal, and 2 agents stepped forward, hands ready to guide Diane toward the vehicle. But she didn't resist with her body. She resisted with her words. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day you'll see I was right. And when that day comes, don't say I didn't warn you." Her voice shook with conviction, and for a terrifying second, I wondered if she believed it. They placed her in the back of the vehicle. The imposters were already gone. The street, once roaring with chaos, now stood frozen, watching the final act unfold. And then Jacob stepped forward again, his voice raw. "Grant, I don't know what to believe anymore." The words pierced me deeper than Diane's accusations. Because this wasn't a stranger or an enemy or even a rival. This was a friend. A man who had once trusted me, and now, standing in the glow of red and blue lights, he looked at me like I was both protector and threat. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "You don't have to believe me right now," I said quietly. "Just remember who I've been. Remember the man who stood by you, not the one they tried to turn me into." Jacob's eyes glistened, his lips trembling, but he said nothing. He turned away, disappearing into the crowd. The ache in my chest deepened, but there was no time to linger. Walsh approached, his tone professional but laced with something more human. "We'll handle her, but you need to prepare yourself. This won't end tonight. People don't forget fear that easily." I nodded slowly, the truth of his words settling in my bones. This battle was over, but the war wasn't. Not with Diane's final words echoing in the air like a prophecy. The neighbors began to disperse, their footsteps heavy, their conversations hushed. Some gave me nods of respect. Others avoided my eyes. The fracture remained. I stood alone by the safe, my hand resting on its steel surface. The dog tags dangled from my fingers, their cold weight grounding me. For the first time in years, tears blurred my vision. Not from fear, not from anger, but from the crushing weight of it all. The third engagement line rose in that raw moment, carried by the ache in my chest. When the battle ends and the silence finally settles, what do you do with the scars no one else can see? The night deepened. The flashing lights faded, and the street returned to a fragile stillness. But inside me, nothing was still, because even as Diane was driven away, even as the imposters faced justice, her final warning clung to me like smoke. Maybe it was empty. Maybe it was just the last gasp of a desperate woman. Or maybe, just maybe, she had set something in motion that none of us could stop. And in that possibility, I felt the twist of truth that would haunt me long after the street grew quiet. Sometimes the enemy doesn't vanish when the fight is over. Sometimes they live on in the cracks they've left behind. The days after that night unfolded slowly, like a wound that refused to close. The street was quieter, though not in the way it used to be. The laughter of children still floated from backyards. Sprinklers still hissed across lawns and porch. Lights still clicked on at dusk, but underneath it all, a tension lingered. People smiled less when they passed me. Some nodded respectfully, but others crossed the street, eyes sliding away like I was a shadow they didn't want to step into. Diane was gone, taken by federal agents, but her absence carried more weight than her presence ever had. The echo of her words, "You'll regret this," hung in the air like smoke you couldn't fan away. It wasn't just her voice. It was the fear she planted, the doubt she left behind. And fear has a way of sticking, even after the source is removed. Jacob avoided me. His porch light came on every night, but the two of us never shared beers again. Sometimes I'd see him at the end of the street, tugging his kids inside faster when I stepped out. That betrayal cut deeper than any scar I carried from the battlefield. I had been willing to forgive his hesitation that night, but I couldn't ignore the distance he chose afterward. trust, once cracked, rarely goes back to whole. Dr. Stone checked in on me once. Her voice was steady, grounding, reminding me that the truth often works slower than lies. She told me not to measure victory by the crowd's applause, but by the weight I no longer carried alone. Her words helped, even if they didn't heal everything. Healing, I realized, wasn't the point. Living was, the safe in my garage still sat where it always had, its steel frame humming with quiet strength. But it felt different now. Not just a container of weapons or heirlooms, but a symbol of everything I had fought for, and everything I nearly lost. I didn't open it often anymore. I didn't need to. Just placing my hand on its surface was enough to remind me that what I carried wasn't danger, but history. The neighbors slowly adjusted. Some apologized in small ways, dropping off mail that had been misdelivered, offering a polite nod across the fence. Others remained distant, convinced by fear more than by fact. That was the cost. Even when truth wins, it doesn't always take everyone with it. But I wasn't entirely alone. The woman from the crowd, the one who had spoken up with calm certainty, introduced herself later as Evelyn, a former Army Reserve captain. She stopped by once with a casserole, the old-fashioned neighborly gesture almost startling in its simplicity. She told me, "You stood taller than most could have. Don't let them take that from you." Her words didn't erase the scars, but they reminded me that scars weren't proof of weakness. They were proof I had survived. The imposters? They vanished into the system. Their names never spoken on our street again. They weren't the story, not really. They were pawns in Diane's plan, and once she was gone, so were they. The real story was the fracture she left. One night, weeks later, I sat on my porch with the dog tags in my hand, the metal cool against my skin. The street was silent, the kind of silence that carried both peace and emptiness. I thought of the men whose names were etched there, men who had never come home. I thought of what they might say if they had been standing with me that night. Would they tell me I held the line? Or would they remind me that some battles never end cleanly? I looked at the safe through the garage window, the faint light reflecting off its surface. For the first time, I saw it differently. Not as a line in the sand, not as a fortress, but as a mirror. It reflected back the truth I had carried all along. I wasn't dangerous. I was a man who had been asked to bear more than most, and who had done so without breaking, until someone tried to make the cracks in me their weapon. That night, I whispered something into the quiet. Not a prayer, not a confession, just words that needed to be spoken. I'm still here, and somehow, that was enough. Weeks turned into months. The street kept moving forward. Grass grew, kids rode bikes, holidays brought out strings of lights. Life didn't stop, even if it looked different now. I walked among it all, neither hero nor villain, just a man still carrying his truth. Some nodded, some didn't. But I had learned that not every story ends with applause. Some end with silence, and silence can be powerful too. The last time I saw Diane was in a courtroom sketch that flickered across the evening news. She sat upright, hands folded, still carrying herself like the leader she believed herself to be. They said she was unrepentant, convinced she had done the right thing. I turned off the television before the report ended. Her story wasn't mine to follow anymore. The cost of everything that happened? It wasn't written in arrests or judgments. It was written in the cracks left in friendships, the way neighbors looked at each other differently, the way trust had to be rebuilt one glance at a time. It was written in the sleepless nights where I heard echoes of shouting not from the past, but from the street outside my home. But something else stayed the same. The ground beneath my boots, the weight of the dog tags, the steady hum of the safe behind me, the truth of who I was and what I had endured. Those things, no HOA, no imposters, no lies, could ever take. On my porch, I leaned back one last time, the night air cool against my skin, and I let my gaze settle on the horizon. The street lights buzzed, moths flickered in their glow, and the world kept moving. Maybe trust would never be whole again, maybe scars would never fade. But I knew now that surviving wasn't about erasing the battles. It was about carrying them with dignity. And as I closed my eyes, the image that stayed was simple. The dog, tags swinging lightly in my hand, their sound like a quiet bell cutting through the night. That sound was my ending, my proof, my truth. If you've stayed with me through this story, I want you to carry something too. Share this with others, subscribe for more HOA Truth Tales, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Because stories like these aren't just mine, they're ours. And the more we share them, the harder it is for lies to win.